it's important for me to quickly say this because, by virtue of where we are as a church, I can safely say what I want to say now. that Old Testament and New Testament compartmentalization of the Bible is not inspired by God. It's not inspired by God. Because in the original, there is no Old Testament and there is no New Testament divided. It is the privilege of translators who split the book. Just like chapter and verses are not inspired by God. Chapters and verses were the privilege of translators. They added all of that. That's not in the original. In the original, you just have a letter that started from Genesis and just ran to Revelation without chapter, verses, and punctuations. There's no punctuation, there's no chapter, there's no verse in the original, and there's no division of Old and New Testament. Now that's important for you to know. People think once they start reading the book of Matthew, they're reading the New Testament. But they forget that there is more New Testament in the Old Testament than there is in the New Testament. You didn't hear what I said. There is more New Testament in the Old Testament than there is in the New Testament, because the New Testament is drawn out from the Old Testament. Keep that somewhere, it will come in handy in the course of this. So Jesus taught from the books we refer to as the Old Testament, and that is Genesis to Malachi. And there's nothing in the Bible that says that there is a distinction between Genesis to Malachi and Matthew to Revelation. That's, just an idea that comes up years after the Bible was written. When John, for example, wrote John chapter 1 verse 1, and he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The word there is the word logos. Logos. And it's referring to Genesis. In Genesis was the Word. The word beginning is Genesis. He calls Genesis the Word of God. He calls Genesis the Word of God. So if Genesis is the Word of God, how do you think that the Old Testament is gone? So the concept of the Old Testament and New Testament are derived from studying. It is when you study, you will now know where there is New Testament and where there is Old Testament. You don't use books to divide them. It's in studying, you will know that, okay, this is Old Testament. And in studying, you will know that, okay, this is New Testament. Because there is Old Testament in New Testament, and there is New Testament in Old Testament. Teaching good? Good. Now,